Hey guys, I welcome you all back. So officially now we are entering the practical version of our session. Okay, so in the previous video I was just talking about the theoretical aspect. Now from this episode we will be entering to our session as planned. So the very first part is Dart basics. So I'm going to teach you the basics of Dart that are essential to be known before entering to the Flutter programming. Let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to make use of Dartpad, which is an online Dart compiler. Okay, so if you want to use this as well, then you could go to Google and just search Dartpad. Okay, so if you search Dartpad, the very first link that you get, it will redirect you here. As soon as you get inside, you will be having some scripts here. Okay, don't mind that, just erase it. Let's get started from first. Okay, I got to tell you one concept called function. The Dart language has a feature called function. The function helps you to pack some lines of codes together. Okay, like you pack some codes in a box and take that box whenever you want. So it's like you are writing some lines of codes and packing it together, and you're calling it whenever you need. So that's the purpose of function. Okay, the function is like a container. It may send some value in return, it may receive value, it may not receive value, it may not send value. We will see all the aspects right now. So very first thing is there is a peculiar function in this Dart programming, that is main. Okay, so in order to describe a function, that the syntax that is essential to describe a function is use the name of the function and then parenthesis and curly braces open and close. So this is how you define a function. In all language there is a function, most of the languages there is a function called main. Okay, so this main function is like the entry door for your program's execution. Your compiler, when it starts execution, it searches for main. Okay, so it goes to the main function and from there the parser passes. Okay, so this main function is very important, and no matter what custom function you write, you got to write this main function. This main function is the entry door of your program. So let's give the main function a type void. So what is this void? So if you write function, okay, the function may return something, the function may not return something. Okay, so if in case if the function is not returning something, then you tell the compiler that that particular function won't return any value to anything. So you define that by making use of this keyword called void. Okay, so if in case if the function returns something, maybe let's say this function returns some integer value, you will mention the type as int. Okay, if it's returning something string, you mention it as string. If it's returning some double value, you'll be mentioning it as double. Okay, so that's how you mention the type of the function. In our case, the function won't be returning anything. Okay, so this is void function. So how do we write a custom function? This void function always exists, and it should exist in Dart programming. Like I said, this is the entry gate of your execution. So our work is not here. Okay, so if you want to write your own custom functions, then you, like I said, you name your function. If your function has more than one name, let's say I have two words in this function name. Okay, so one is function and then name, so I have two words. So you can't be using space in between. In when you create function, it will throw you errors. Okay, so function name should not be having any sort of spacing. So very famous convention that globally all programmers follow is naming your function in camel case style. So what is camel case styling is the very first word of the naming starts with small, the very first word. And when you enter some other word, maybe your function name might have a couple of words. From the next word, you can start the very next word in caps and then again start it and continue the rest of the letters in small. So this is a way of naming your function. This is the standard one. And like I said, if you want to write a function properly, you should be making use of pair of parentheses and then a pair of curly braces. So this curly braces is like open and close door of your function. This parenthesis is to tell your compiler that this is a function, as well as this is like the window for the function to get values externally. Okay, I'll be looking shortly how to get some values and return values now. Okay, so this is the overall idea of how we create function. So now give some type to this function. So I'm planning on creating function to add two numbers. Okay, so I'm going to add two numbers. So add numbers, let's say. That's how I'm planning on creating the name of the function. Since this is going to do addition, I'm naming this as adding numbers. Okay, so now since this is a addition function, okay, let's say I'm adding integer variables, so the result is also going to be integer. When you add two integers, the result will be integer. So I'm going to return integer type. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare the type as int. Okay, so now what happens? Now you get some warning here. So what it means is you are telling the compiler that this particular function is going to return something of type int, but you didn't mention the compiler what it's going to return or how it's going to return. Okay, so in order to tell the compiler that this function is returning some value, you make use of the keyword called return. Okay, so for that, this is how you write it. Initially, let's say I'm returning 0. You got to return something, right? So let's say for now I'm returning 0. Okay, now this is done. So if you run this program, it won't do anything. Okay, you won't get any sort of display here. So it's because even though you have written your own function, you didn't call it in your main program. Like I said, main program is the entry and exit of execution. Your parser enters here and sees everything here. If you have something like function, it will branch out to there and execute and come back here. If it doesn't find anything and it just found the closing curly braces, then your execution stops. So in order to call your function, what you got to do is you got to enter the name of the function that you want to call. Okay, in my case, I'm going to call numbers, add numbers. Okay, so I'm going to call this function and parenthesis and colon. So this colon is like you're telling the compiler that the statement has ended. So this is, if you have any prior programming experience, most of this will be boring because I'm teaching you very basic. If the viewers are new to programming, so I'm doing it in such an aspect. If you have already experienced programming, it might sound a bit boring for you. You just speed up the video. I will tell you when some Dart specific comes. Okay, I will tell you. At that time, you just pass it and see that particular thing carefully, and then again speed it up. So this is for viewers who already have prior programming experience. If you're new to programming, you could see this. I will just tell you in a perspective of a person who don't know the programming language and learning for first time. So this is how you call the function. Now if you call this function, even if you print it, you don't do anything. Okay, because we didn't display the value in the console, we didn't store it anywhere, we didn't print it anywhere. Okay, this function is executing, but we didn't do anything. So how do we get the value from the function? Okay, so in order to do that, we make use of something called variables. So variables are like boxes in the program that helps you to store some value temporarily until that particular code, that particular program executes. Okay, during the execution time, the variable will be holding the value. In order to create the variable, you make use of a keyword called var. So var, name of your variable, let's name my variable as variable 1. Okay, var 1. In order to assign the value to your variable, you make use of this equal to. Okay, so this equal to helps you to assign the value that is being returned by the add numbers function to the variable 1, var 1. So you need to print this, right? In order to display the value on screen, you make use of the keyword called print. This is a function. Okay, this is function written inside inbuilt. We are just making use of that. So print, and you open parenthesis and you close it with colon, and inside you just mention this variable. Okay, so now if you run the program, you will be seeing 0 in console, which means this particular function has executed and it has written value 0, which is stored in variable 1, and you're printing the variable 1. Let's say you are willing to print some text along with the value. Okay, so let's say that you want to print you want to make your console display that the value is, and then you want to display the value. So you are going to print something, okay, some series of strings. So in order to make your print function understand that you're willing to print some strings, you can make use of pair of double quotes, okay, and then some text inside. The value is, okay. So now when you do this, what happens is the var1, the variable, it displays just as var1 because you sent everything as string to the print function. So the print function considers everything as string and it displays just the same, okay. So in order to make your print function understand that this particular thing is a variable, you are going to make use of a special character called dollar. So when you add dollar, you can see the color changes. So what it means is, you can see in the documentation it says variable, local variable. So now you are helping your print function to understand that that particular variable is a local variable, a variable, okay. So it may be global or local depending on the way of declaration it is considered. Let me get into the scope part later, scope of the variables. So for now, if what happens if you are planning on, you know, entering this var1 outside this quotes, so then what happens, you'll be getting some errors, okay. So you could see if you try to execute this one, you'll be getting some errors stating that it's getting too many arguments. So when I talk about the argument part, it will be a bit more clear to you. This particular print function, it will take strings, and if you want to print some values inside, display some values inside, you make use of dollars. So this is what you got to understand right now, okay. Now now when you display this, you will be having the value is, and then you will get your value in the console, okay. So now let's get into the next part, that is we are trying to pass some values to the add numbers and then we get the result and print it here, okay. This parenthesis, the pair of parentheses you see here, okay. So I said that this act as a window where your function could get some value and it processes the value and it will be sending the result through this return keyword, okay. So in order to send some arguments, the value that you send through this particular window, it's called argument, okay. In order to, let's say I'm passing two numbers, okay. So in technical terms you will be calling it as two arguments, okay. So now you get the warning here because you have not described that this function is getting any sort of arguments, okay. So in order to tell the Dart program that this particular function is going to receive some arguments, in order to tell that, you got to declare some variables. Like I said, variables are like containers, okay. So you want to declare some variables in order to hold the values inside. So in order to do that, let's say I'm declaring a and b, okay. So I'm declaring two variables in here, okay. So now by default declare something inside this pair of parentheses without giving it some type, okay. So by default it will be taking the value as dynamic. So you could see that the variable a's type is dynamic, so the Dart by default considers it, and based on the value that you pass, the type of the variable changes, okay. So even if you pass it like this, let's say I'm planning on returning the added up value of a and b, okay. So if we run this, the code gets executed, you will be getting a result as 3, okay. So you could see that, but it is a good thing that it is good to explicitly mention the type of the variable in here. That's a good practice. Even though in Dart it's automatically recognized, it's a good practice to mention the type before the variable, okay. So now you tell the Dart explicitly that this particular variable is of type integer. So now what's the problem, what you need to note when you try to declare a variable explicitly. So after, you know, declaring the type as integer, if you try to pass some float value, let's say a double value, that is the decimal type, let's say 0.5, 1.5, that's a decimal value. So if you try to execute this function now, it throws an error because you have declared the type of the variable b as integer, but you are passing a double value, so it throws some error. And again, if you are, let's say now you are declaring this as double, okay. So now again when you run it, you will be getting error because when you add an integer and a double, variable, okay, the resultant will be a double value. When you're adding an integer value and a double value, the resultant is going to be a double value. But what you have said that this function will return a value that is of type integer. So in here, if you change it to double, let's say, now you won't be having any errors, the code will execute, because even though you add an integer and a double, the resultant value is a double, so you are going to return a type double, and hence the value will be printed correctly. So now let's say you are giving type double but you are passing integer. Now you won't get any error, because even though you are passing an integer value to a double variable, the variable considers the integer value as, let's say you are giving a whole value 2, the double variable sees it as 2.0. For that, it's a decimal value with no trailing zeros. Okay, it's like a complete number, 2.0. Okay, so that's how the variable sees it, so you don't get any errors. Now if you want to declare, yeah, I got to tell this, if you want to declare a variable with specific types, let's say integer or string or double, like I said, you will be making use of the keywords like int, double, and in case of string, you should start the type as capital S. Okay, so usually for integer, double, all those you will be starting from small, okay, in order to define the type. But in case of string, the typing, it starts from capital S, and then you will be making use of this variable whatever you want, let's say string1. Okay, so that's how you define a variable. Okay, so now here what you get is you're not making use of this variable anywhere, so that's the warning here, no issues. There is also another way of defining the variable, like you have seen here. Okay, so if you define a variable using where, that variable is dynamic by nature, so you could see that in the documentation. So what it means is, if this variable gets value 0, that is integer, its type automatically changes to integer. If you are giving some double value, it changes to double. If you're giving some string, let's say string xenon, now it gets to string. And I got to tell another thing, while you are defining string, okay, you can make use of pair of single quotes or pair of double quotes. So it should not be a mixture of pair of single quote and double quote, like this, let's say like this. So this is wrong. Okay, so if you are starting with single quotes, you should end with single quotes. It should be like in pairs. Okay, so no mixing of that. Once you start to learn using strings with a particular quote, let's say you are practicing it with double quotes, try to continue with that, don't confuse. Okay, so that's some basic stuffs in functions. So now you have learned what is a main function, okay, and what are the custom functions, how to define a function, what is the return keyword does, okay, how to define the type of the function, the argument passing and argument receiving. So this is how you pass the argument, this is how you receive the argument. So we have seen all these. Okay, now we are going to see another concept called class. Okay, so before getting into this class, I got to remind you one thing, that in Flutter everything is a widget. Okay, so you won't be having any sort of graphical interface to drag and drop some widgets and develop your application. It's not like that. You will be coding each and every widget. Okay, so you no need to panic, because it's really easy. So in order to create a widget, you will be declaring a class and you'll be extending some other class, and inside the class only you'll be developing the widget. Okay, so you'll be calling the class in your main function, and in order to do that in Flutter, in order to run app, there are some techniques. I'll be talking about that later, but all you need to know right now is, in Flutter we make use of class to create widgets. Okay, so remember that right now. Let's see what is class in terms of basics. Okay, so in order to create a class, we make use of a keyword called class. It's simple. And in order to name the class, we start the name from caps. Let's say I'm creating a class to get people data. Okay, let me name the class as person data. Okay, so what's the difference between naming the class from naming a function is, in function, when your name has many words, what happens is very first word you started with small, and then when you add next word to the name, it starts with caps and again it trails with small. But in case of class, when you name a class, the starting word, okay, the starting will start with caps, okay, and then it trails with small. And if you have some other name, again as usual, it starts with caps and trails with small. This is the naming convention for naming a class. Okay, so these are standard conventions. Even though you can, name your class in your own style, even if you name your class like this and declare your class, okay, even this way you can declare your class. Here you could see that name type using upper camel case line. So it works, but the standard convention is using capital. Here the way you in order to create the class, what you got to do is you will be making use of the keyword class, and then you will be naming the class and the open and close curly braces. In case of class, you won't be making use of this pair of parentheses. For only for function, you will be making use of the parentheses. In order to define the class, you won't be making use of the parentheses. Okay, so now the class is created. Let's create two variables inside. Okay, so the first variable is going to be of type string, and the variable is going to be name. And let's say I'm giving this name a default value Xenon. Okay, so now this variable is assigned a name Xenon. Now next, let me say I'm giving integer. Okay, so I'm getting age. Okay, so it's of type int. So now I'm assigning it a value 20. This thing is done. I have spelled it wrong. Now it's correct. So now that you have created the variables inside the class person data, there is a way you call these variables when it's inside the class. It is called as properties. So this particular class has property, name, and age. That is a normal convention, a way in which you describe the variables inside the class, and that is the standard way. So inside the class, when you define a function, let's say you are writing this function within this class. Okay, this particular function is inside this class. Now this function is called method, it's not called as function. That's the way you call stuffs when it is inside the class, and when it is outside the class you treat it differently. So these are normal way of describing something inside programming language. So if you're new to programming language, just try to remember these. Okay, so now we have created the name. And another thing I forgot to tell you is, here I was talking about arguments, right? So this warning you get it because now the method is inside, that is the function is inside. Okay, I was telling you about the arguments, right? So now we got two arguments here and we are passing two arguments. Okay, what happens if we pass more than two? You will be getting an error because you are passing more value than normal. So when you run this, you will be getting argument that doesn't match, and too many positional arguments and stuff. Something similar that you saw when you were working with print function, right? So this is the error I was talking about. So if you want to define the, if you want to help the print to understand that you are trying to print the value without using the dollar style, there is one way. Okay, so you can make use of an operator called plus, and then you can directly mention the variable. Okay, so as soon as you have written this var1 variable outside the print function, this plus operator is used to add something in your print text. Okay, so this is like helps you to combine different sets of text together. Okay, so if you want to add some variable value in middle of the text, then you can do so. But what happens here is the print function takes only the string type as argument. Okay, so the problem is now we are trying to pass a double type. Okay, so it can be passed as an argument here because the parameter, the value mismatches. Okay, so in order to help the print function to print the value as string, there is one utility function called toString. Okay, so it helps you to convert whatever the value it may be a double or integer apart from string. If it is apart from string, then this utility function helps you to convert that to string, so that your print function recognizes that particular value that is held inside that variable as string. So how can we make use of that is by adding the dot and then to string. So what it does is it converts your value inside the variable 1 to string. So the print function will, you'll get it as the value is and then the number 3.5 that's displayed here. So this is how you try to put value outside. Okay, you try to define a variable outside and show the value in print. So this looks bit of deep in Dart. In terms of Dart, our goal is to learn Flutter in deep and just the basics of Dart that is required for coding in Flutter. But I just want you to know at least some deep basics in Dart so that these techniques might be useful somewhere in the Flutter, because the print function that we use here, we use something called text widget in the Dart which does something similar. So that's why I'm trying to explain all of this to you. Next, let's see how can we access the properties of the person data. So in order to access the properties within which is present within the class, what you got to do is you got to define an instance of the class. Okay, so in order to do that, you got to declare a variable. So in our case, let's declare a variable as object1. So this Dart programming, this Dart language is an object oriented language. Everything is objects in Dart. Okay, so in Flutter, everything is widgets. So how to define the instance of the class? We can do that like this: person data. Okay, so this is how you declare the instance of the class. If you have prior programming experience, then you might have created the instance of a class by making use of key term called new in other languages, but in Dart you no need to make use of this new term. Instead, you can directly call the class and assign it. When you assign the instance of the class to the variable, when you define an instance, you have to call your class by using this parenthesis. You will be also passing the value to the class. Okay, I'll be telling how you can dynamically assign the values for the properties within the class. We are going to relate this in Flutter, and I'm going to tell you how when I'm getting inside Flutter. So for that case, in order to make the instance for a class, you have to call the class and make sure that you use this pair of parentheses at the end of the name and then the colon. So now when you see into the object, when you move your cursor to the object, you might see that the object is of type person data, which means we have instantiated this object to person data. So now what we're going to do is, in order to access the properties present within the class, we are going to again make use of the dot operator. Let's say I'm intending to make use of the name variable, that is the property of person data. In order to do that, if I want to print the name, I'm calling the object, the instance of the class, and then making use of the dot operator, and then referring the property which is present inside. Since by default we have defined the properties of the class, the name property as Xenon and age as 20. Okay, so when you call the name and when you call the age, you'll be able to see the value displayed as Xenon 20, and then you have printed this, so you will be getting this kind of output. So now the next question is, in reality we will be having dynamic data, there is no static data. So we should make sure that this class is able to assign data dynamically. Okay, so in order to assign different values to these properties, we will be making use of a concept called constructor. What does this constructor do and how to define it? Let's look on to that. So in order to define a constructor, you have to call the name of the class, same name of the class within the class like this, and you got to make use of this parenthesis. So this parenthesis, it looks like function, but since you are calling the same name of the class, okay, so the compiler recognizes that it is the constructor of this particular class. So in reality, in application, you'll be making use of multiple constructors. Okay, I will tell you roughly what are the types of constructors, possible types of constructors also as well. So this how you define a constructor. You define the constructor by making use of parentheses, then an open curly braces, then a closed curly braces. So this how a constructor is defined. Now this constructor will be getting some values, okay, some arguments. The class can define its property dynamically only with the help of constructor, and the value will be obtained through the arguments of the constructor. Okay, so this is the window of getting the data. So here we will be making use of a string variable and a name variable. It can be dynamic as well. Okay, so now the variable will be dynamic, so it will automatically take the value of whatever data you pass. Even if that's the case, the really good practice is you got to explicitly define it. Okay, that's a good practice, and it will help you to avoid some confusion and glitches. So now how do we define the value of the variable? To how do you assign it to the property of the class? In order to do that, just call the property, that is, put the property in the left hand side and make use of equal to assigning operator, and then the variable that you use here as argument. Okay, so now what you're doing is, whatever the value that you get in a string value that you get in a, it will be automatically dynamically assigned to name. So now for age, we are making use of the variable b. So now you get a warning here. What is that is, you have given two arguments here, but you're not passing anything here. That's what the compiler is telling. So if you pass, let's say, a name and an age, then this warning will fade off, and when you run this, you will print this name here and this age here. What happened in background is, you are passing the string nivak and age 22, so it's being assigned to string a and b, and in turn the value of a and b is being assigned to the properties name and age, and when you call that property, it's being displayed. So this is what's going behind. I told you that a class can have multiple constructors, right? So let's see how to create multiple constructors. But before that, you have to understand that Dart language don't support constructor overriding. But there is a way in which you can define multiple constructors for a particular class. Okay, so in order to do that, what you do is, usually if you, let's say, if you create another constructor even with different number of arguments, you will be getting some errors. In order to tell the Dart compiler that you are creating another kind of constructor, you can hold named constructors, okay, with different parameters. What is named constructor is, usually you have defined a constructor, so this is a default constructor, and you have some default values, that is, you're dynamically assigning the values here. So this particular constructor is default for this class, but again you want to create more constructors, okay, but a particular class can have only one default constructor, so you are creating the constructors in terms of names. Okay, so like this, let me name this constructor as c1. Okay, so I'm calling this constructor, I'm naming this constructor as c1. Okay, so in c1, this type of constructor, what I'm getting is, I'm just getting the age. Okay, so let me assign the value default to the property name. As soon as I have assigned the value, let's run this by creating the instance for that particular class. So in order to create instance for that class, what I got to do is, I got to call the name of that class. So this is something peculiar within that class. So in order to invoke that particular constructor, you got to call it by name. You got to call the constructor's name, and inside, what you have done here, you just receive the integer. Okay, so you can pass only integer value as the argument for this constructor, and let's try calling it. So object2. Now when you run this program, very first time you are calling the default constructor. Okay, so you'll be getting nivak and 22 because you have passed your nivak and 22. The second time when you're calling the name constructor, you are just passing the integer value. Okay, so you are not passing the name. In that case, what we have done is, we have assigned a default value to name. So what happens when this particular constructor is called, it assigns the default as a value for the property name, and then the value that we have passed for its age. So this is to give you an idea that a constructor can be handled like this within the class. So these concepts are useful in order to understand some basic utility calling functions or widgets within the Flutter program. So I will try to relate it with this when I'm teaching you the basics of Flutter, and when we develop the application and when we develop our own custom widgets, these concepts will be helpful. So far you would have had a overall idea on what is a function and how to define a custom function, what is a main function, why it is peculiar, and then you have seen the basics of class and how to define different constructors for a class. And now again I had to tell you another shortcut, okay, for passing values within the constructor. Okay, so what we have done here is we have got the argument here and then you have passed it here to the properties. So this is like a roundabout method. So there is another way in which you can directly assign the value to the properties without going through the hustle of introducing another variable and then assigning to it. So you can do that by directly calling your properties with a key term this. Okay, so this key term, okay, so it tells your constructor that it tells your dart compiler that you are pointing to the property directly. Okay, so if you are trying to get the value by just the property names, okay, so how the constructor thinks is it creates another variable locally. Okay, so this variable will be local within the constructor. It won't assign you directly to this. So in order to give you an idea, it don't assign. Let me show you by executing this code. What happens is if I run this code, you won't get this nivak and 22 at first. It will be null. So what you understand is the value here we didn't assign anything, so by default it is null. But you have sent the value here, okay, to the name and age. But the constructor thought that this name and age are new variable. So this variable has lifetime only within this particular constructor. Okay, so within the open and close curly braces. In order to tell your compiler that you are pointing directly to the property, you got to make use of this keyword, okay, this and dot operator. That helps your compiler to understand that you are pointing to the property of that class. So this is one way of presenting your data to your constructor. There is one another way in which you can do it. So in that way you can point your variable and then that is the property. You can point your property and then pass the value. So in order to accomplish this, you got to make use of parenthesis inside the constructor. So if you do that, okay, so you will be able to pass the value based on the position. So when you run this, now you will be getting nivak and age 22 and you will be getting the rest of the stuff that we have printed here. Okay, so what is unique about this is when you pass the arguments based on its position, okay, that is when you name the arguments. This is called named argument passing. Okay, so this is one technique of passing. Even though if you jumble the order of passing, it will work out correct. So you could see that again after the executing this particular code, you get the same result. So what happens when you don't do that and you just jumble the order when you pass the arguments normally? I will show that as well. So in this case, when you pass it directly, you are trying to assign 22 to string and nivak to integer, so it's going to throw an error. You will see that for yourself. Yeah, you saw that. So you can be passing string to integer and you can be passing integer to string, so you got that error. So that's what you're getting here. So in order to pass argument by naming the property directly, then you will be making use of this pair of curly braces. Now you can call the property and then pass the value. So this is another way of passing the values to construct arguments to the constructor. Okay, so you can get overall idea about the class. Now before moving to the Flutter, so I have given you some overall view of Dart basics, which is sufficient for a while of travel in Flutter. Okay, let's not go completely in Dart, then it will be boring. I will come back to Dart when it is necessary to learn new concepts. Let's go with Flutter and Dart parallel.